Welcome to a brand new episode of OTMT, which stands for Off the Main Thread. We have more tangents than content, and that's how we roll. I am Surma.
And I am Jake, and welcome.
And welcome. Yeah, at this point, it is customary to thank Shopify for letting us record this and giving us money to have this out on the web for you all to listen to. So thank you, Shopify.
And ultimately, money so we can just eat and stuff. I mean, that's not for the podcast. That's the job, really. But you know what? It's nice.
Eating is nice. Who would have thought? Speaking of very important life advice, I was in the hospital because I'm a smart boy.
Uh-oh.
We've been trying to do some upcycling, and we had some bedside tables, and we were like, they're too tall.
Oh, sorry. Hey, hang on. Do you know what? Because you're in the hospital, I was looking for, I was thinking of you're going to be having some kind of major accident, which maybe you are. But so when you said upcycling, my visual brain just tried to visualize you on a bike trying to cycle up a building. And I said, well, that'll do. Yeah, of course.
That's how he broke both legs. No, furniture, upcycling.
I do a cross cycling. And you know what? That's been okay for me so far. Anyway, sorry, you're upcycling.
Yes, I'm upcycling. And we're like, we could get new ones and try to sell these. Or we tried to do the DIY thing and we saw some legs and we paint them a new color. And I am proud to tell you that the sawing is not the origin of the injury.
I was going to say you sawed off the wrong legs.
That would have been quite impressive. No, we just, it went really well. We sawed the leg off, we sanded them down, we painted them for a first DIY. Well, not first, but nothing I've really completely done before. I was quite okay with it. And so they were drying, it was all done. I was just cleaning the brushes, and I had some white spirit to clean the brush more effectively, and I was putting the brush into a little, basically a little glass with white spirit, swirling it around, and I was a bit careless, and it splashed upwards and straight into my eye.
Oh no.
And I was like, oh, is it in my eye, or did I close my eye quickly enough? Because it felt fine. There was no sensation. It was just obviously the smell of white spirit on your skin isn't great, so I was like, I'm gonna finish cleaning the brush. And then I'm gonna start Googling what you need to do. On the bottle, it didn't say anything. It said what you should do if it's on your skin, when you drink it, when you inhale it, but nothing what to do when you get it into your eye. And so I was Googling, and while I was Googling, I noticed that my eye started to feel a bit weird.
Uh-oh.
Online, it said, you need to wash your eye under running water, rinse your eyeball for 20 minutes.
Which is hard work. 20 minutes? What? 20 minutes?
Yeah. So, and
would your eye get all wrinkly? If you wash your hand for 20 minutes, it gets all wrinkly. I suppose your eye would get the same. It sort of looked like
same. Absolutely, it was
testicle with a pupil.
The eye testicle. It was where it ended up. I guess I don't want to lose my eyesight or anything.
No.
And so I went into my shower and I lied down and I used my shower head and kind of hold my eye open and rinsed my eyeball.
Oh.
And then my partner came up and was like, why are you lying in the shower in your underwear and rinsing your face? And so I explained it, and she was kind of freaking out. I was like, no, stay calm. But it does say ask for medical advice, call 111, the not super emergency thing. And so while I was there in the shower with a shower head in my eyeball, she put the nice lady from 111 on speaker, and we talked it through, and she was like, you did the right thing, but it is quite aggressive and you need to go to the hospital just to be safe.
Before you get to that, I do feel so people on the outside might not know this, but 111 is the number you call when your arm's a bit damaged. It's not life-threatening. So 999 is the emergency services. It just feels like there's a real opportunity there to do the full range.
How deep is your injury? Measure it, and the number of centimeters is the number you call. For 3 centimeters, call 333.
Yeah, it's this is feeling like a 666 situation. Oh, hang on, that might be something else.
I mean, I was going to say that.
Yeah, okay, hang on. I think we've just solved why they don't do that. Okay, sorry. Anyway, so you're hospital bound, right? Is that what I understand?
Yeah, and last time I was in the hospital, it was, the NHS is stretched thin, and I was there from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. last time, and that was a horrible experience just because you had to stay awake. But this sounds like, okay, my partner, you stay here, you look after the dog. There's no point for the two of us being bored to death again in the hospital. I'm going to Uber there and going to have it sorted out. And so I got myself an Uber. And while I was in the Uber, my partner was like, please tell me, keep me updated. I'm a bit anxious. I also may have taken some pictures on your phone. And so while I was in the I looked at my camera roll, and there I am just lying in the shower in my pants with a shower head in my face. And I was like, you know what? Fair play.
Well, we'll link to those in the description.
Fair play by her to just seize the moment while waiting for the 101 day to pick up. But in the end, it was actually fairly short. Like, the hospital, for some reason, wasn't busy. I got my turn really quickly to be triaged, and she did a quick... Do you know litmus paper, which changes color depending on whether the solution is acidic or...
They put that in your eye?
They had put paper in both my eyes to see if it has the same acidity, because my left eye was unaffected. They say if it's the same acidity, you probably washed most of it away.
That's clever.
Weird, but clever. And so in the end, I got a couple of eye drops and an ointment just because turns out washing your eyeball for 20 minutes with just straight up water, not even saline solution, will irritate your eye a bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm proud to report no eyesight was lost.
Hey.
No consequences, but I felt like a proper idiot just cleaning a brush and splashing white spirit into my eye. So yeah.
It can happen. I remember when I was a young teenager, there was this new deodorant came out called Physio Sport, and there'll be a section of people who know what I'm talking about. It was one of those kind of like, powder. It's one of the sort of early sort of aerosol, but powdery. You know what I mean?
The one that leave nice white streaks on everything.
Yes, exactly that. They were giving out free samples, and I had one of these. I just sort of had it at my desk, and it's got like a sort of click, like rotation lock. It kind of locks. You know the thing, right? Anyway, so I had that on my... I was just I was just playing some games or, coding or something. And I sort of play around with things that are on my desk. And I just sort of picked up this Physio Sport thing and I just sort of like tapped it against my cheek bone. And I thought it was locked and it wasn't. Because when I did that, it just went, pfft, and then I just sort of froze because I panicked. And this, like, I was at point blank range of my eyeball pretty much. But because it was angled upwards, I got away scot-free. Now, there was white powder on the end of my eyelashes.
Wow.
That's how close it was. And I just think of like, Jake, that was very stupid. I know we've gone from a couple of episodes ago stories about me being under a train, and now that. I feel like I've actually been quite lucky. Yeah.
There's a pattern, mate. They do say to women here in the UK that they should have a deodorant with them as a way to defend themselves, because pepper spray is not allowed to be carried. Well, in Germany, as a woman, you can get pepper spray and have it in your handbag as a self-defense tool. So yeah, deodorant is apparently the next best thing. So you almost did that to yourself. Well done.
If you have pepper spray and deodorant, there's always the risk you mix them up.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to smell like pepper spray under your armpits, I think.
I imagine that would irritate you. Should we talk about the web?
Let's talk about the web. What are we talking about today, Jake?
I want to ask the question, are web components worth it?
Oh, that's going to be such a good title.
Oh, yeah. You see, this is title first. Authoring, absolutely. So let's dig in, right? And I want your opinions on this as well, because it's something we've sort of both worked in and around.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's start from the start. Web component is a sort of umbrella term for a bunch of stuff like HTML custom elements, the shadow DOM, and template elements, and maybe some other kind of CSS features fall under that as well.
Yeah.
At a low level, it gives you a number of abilities that the browser already has. So you put an input element on the page.
Yes.
It has its own set of attributes, own set of properties. Custom elements let you hook into this. So you can have your own tags, your own associated classes. By classes, I mean like a JavaScript class, like a interface, a prototype, that kind of thing. And you also get a lot of little callbacks to tell you when attributes have changed and when an element's been connected to the DOM and disconnected from the DOM. I would say I don't like those. I don't like that as an API design. I don't like that it's part of the public API. You know what I mean?
I agree that there's some design choices for the custom elements API that I'm not a huge fan of. As a principle, I like custom elements exposing the capabilities that the native HTML tags are already using. But I'm guessing they didn't actually, at the time, I think, like behavior was specified, not how it's implemented. So I'm guessing there wasn't just, let's just expose what the browsers already have, because it would have been wildly different across browsers. So they needed to design something. And some is fine. I think some is a bit short-sighted, like the fact that custom element registry isn't namespaced, which makes librarification a bit complicated.
Oh, yeah.
The attribute changed callback seems a bit weird, maybe even unnecessary, because you could just use like a mutation observer on yourself, I suppose. I don't know.
I think the difference is the timing. I think attribute change callback is synchronous, whereas the mutation observer equivalent is microtask bound. But even then, it's called the revealing constructor pattern, and this is the one. If you do new promise, you pass it a function, and you're given the resolve and reject functions inside there, and that means you've kind of got private access to those functions.
Is streams the same pattern?
Well, with streams, no, it's not quite the same pattern because you
get access to the controller inside the constructor object.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, with streams, you pass an object with callbacks, but obviously those callbacks are private, and then in those callbacks you get given the controller. So it is a very similar model. I would have thought like the super call, because you've got my custom component extends HTML element, and then in your constructor you call super, and I think that's maybe where they could have done the same pattern. I imagine the argument was, it's better to have it on the prototype because then there's only one instance of the function across all the elements, where, if you're doing it in the constructor call, you're likely to have lots of instances. Anyway, let's not get bogged down on that. Because the other thing that you can do, think about input type color or input type range. There's a lot of interface there that appears when you put that on the page. It's one tag in your page, but there's a lot of moving parts, interactive and all of that sort of stuff. Shadow DOM is what explains this in a way, because it gives you the same abilities. You create this little kind of hidden DOM within the regular DOM that's sort of kind of hidden, kind of not. And this is where you put, you build up your interface. And styling is also scoped within that as well. I fundamentally like this. Apart from my little complaints about the API and whatever, I like that it's explained some of the platform that was previously unexplained. Like how does an input have all of this bits of interface associated with it? And it lets us do the same thing with our own stuff,
Yes.
This whole thing was developed by Chrome, like in the open at the W3C, but it was really just Chrome. And this was in the early 2010s. And they shipped it. And then a few years later, Safari came along and went, well, we're interested in this, but we want a bunch of changes. So then there were breaking changes, and that was like in the mid 2010s.
That was custom elements V0 versus
V1. Yeah, and I think it was actually fair for. I mean, you could argue it either way. Like Chrome shipping something that really hadn't been closely looked at by other browser vendors was not great. But then on the other side of that is like, it's sort of bad that other browser vendors could hold the web back by just not taking part,
Yeah.
So whatever, I don't know quite where I sit on that. But I think most of the changes that Safari wanted are good. Don't ask me too much what they were. It's actually really hard to find the original web component specs. A few differently named functions. I think there was some things like where you could create many shadow routes for one element at some point. And anyway,
was Shadow DOM part of the initial design?
Yes, it was. It's still sort of developed as a kind of separate feature, and there was also things like HTML imports, which just died off really. Which was kind of like a single HTML file, which had the template and the behavior, a single file for a component.
Oh, that was a thing, yes. In retrospect, not really something that I miss, I have to admit. Because I feel like one of the things, and maybe you get into this, but custom elements are really just that. Web components and custom elements by extension are not really, for me, a primitive to substitute components as we call those components in React. It's really individual elements. And I feel like once you go into higher level components, it gets unwieldy. And I'm not sure they're well fit for that.
I absolutely agree. And I think this is where things went a little bit wrong. We both worked at Google at the time. The narrative was always that, I don't know, it always felt...
Oh, are you going to use the platform?
Use the platform meme. But I felt like, I don't know, as a DevRel team, we picked up a lot of flack saying Google's DevRel team is always pushing web components. And I was kind of looking around going, I don't think we are. We've got one guy kind of working on it. And I think it was a different team. This is the Polymer team. And they were sort of pushing their library and web components as a competitor to React. And I agree with what you just said. I think these are different things. Like, we did a whole show on bringing React to the web and kind of how it works, but like, it's an abstraction of the web platform, whereas web components are exposing new bits of the platform. I think that's the sort of, like, in React, you're saying, create me a DOM tree that looks like this. I call them DOM orchestration frameworks, and no one else does, but fine. Whereas like web components is like, here is an HTML element. Here's what to do when this is created and when this is modified. And they're similar, but yeah, I agree that they're different, especially when you get onto the sort of larger things. And I think one tell there is that lit HTML was created, which was to do the DOM orchestration thing with web component, like in and around web components. Another argument is, what about performance? And a lot of React sites are badly built. I mean, they just are. But it was worse back in the 2010s, right? But I think, especially these days, I don't think there's anything about the DX that makes React fundamentally bad. And I think that's why at Google, we built stuff with Preact. I think React is way heavier than 99% of sites using it need. And, for 50K versus 3K or whatever, you can do this stuff in Preact.
And so far, Preact compat mode lets me use multiple libraries from the React ecosystem that I want. So like, it's really tough for me to like justify using React over Preact, unless if you have like a cross-platform app where the same components run in React Native or something. But yeah, like I just grab Preact with compat mode if I want to use a library. It's really good.
But even then, I feel we kind of managed to convince people at Google that, look, yeah, you can build stuff with Preact and it'd be fast. And so people are like, okay, so React slow, Preact fast. And it's like, well, no, I don't think it's that either. It's like, well, you can build fast stuff with React.
Yeah, I think actually I would assume that if we were to say like Squoosh and have it rendered with React rather than Preact, it would have the same runtime performance.
Yeah.
Loading performance would get worse because it's a bigger library. But in terms of like, I don't think there's fundamental speed benefits in how Preact manages its VDOM and the diffing and the reconciliation over React. I think there's probably a couple of things that are, some code might break because Preact actually lets you add arbitrary event handlers and kind of stuff, which React doesn't. I think it's just about to finally get fixed. But yeah, I think React is not inherently slow or inherently slower than Preact.
Yeah, so like first interaction time would go up on Squoosh just because we're going from like 20K to 60K just because of the size of React. But yeah, ultimately it's fast after that. And even then, like compared in most sites, that's a drop in the ocean, right? And because the reason these things get slow is because people actually, they lose control of their builds. Like that's where the slowness comes in. It's loads of third-party libraries, different versions of the same third-party library that, and I think Preact sites are probably faster as a whole because the kind of people who cared enough to pick Preact over React care enough to be looking at their build more.
Yeah.
And then, so yeah, lit HTML actually has some nice tricks up its sleeve in terms of how it does the diffing. I don't think it's really diffing, but that kind of equivalent. But then we've got signals in Preact as well, which are, fun tricks. So I think that's performance-wise, I don't think there's a big difference really. So what about the DX, right? So we've got web components compared to React and all similar prop-based frameworks. Well, if you're writing a web component, you have to care about properties versus attributes, which we talked about a couple of shows ago. I've got a blog post where I dig into that a bit more. Like if you're doing a React component, all you care about is the props, whereas a custom element has getters, setters, has like methods and things. If you want things to work straight from just HTML, then you're limited to attributes, which are strings or like structures of inner elements for your data. A bit like how the select element has an inner structure of option groups and options that you can do that as well. You need to care about elements disconnecting and reconnecting, which on the surface sounds similar to mount and unmount in React, but they're actually different because with a real HTML element, you can disconnect it and you can put it back, or you could put it somewhere else, but it is the same one.
With the same state.
Yeah, that doesn't happen in React. If an element moves around, it isn't unmounted. Like, unmounting is this is going away forever, and mounting is this thing is new.
I've actually completely forgotten about those hooks in React components because the functional components have become so much the standard with hooks instead of using these lifecycle callbacks that I forgot that React even exposes that. But yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that's what the equivalent is now is use effect with a empty array.
Returns a cleanup function.
Yeah, and with a cleanup function, and that's your mount and unmount. Yeah, sure. Elements can have methods, which is, a thing. You can kind of have methods on things in React, but they recommend against it. Shadow DOM gives you scoped CSS, but frameworks give you equivalents with like CSS modules. And there's also new CSS features like scoped CSS and CSS layers and resets, all of that sort of stuff. One of the nice things is custom elements can be genuine form inputs, which I like, and I think it's a little less known. Like you can create your custom element, which when the parent form is submitted via a submit button or whatever, your custom element will tell the system what its value is, what its name is, what its value is.
I guess most of the time in other areas, you just create hidden input fields for that, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's pretty easy. Just put an input type hidden there, and there you've got the ability to do a name and a value. You couldn't put file data in there. It's probably the only bit that's different, I think. But then there's all kinds of sort of limitations. Like custom elements cannot be forms. They can be form fields, but they can't be forms.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So there is a syntax. You would do form, and then you would have the as attribute. And I'm losing confidence that it's the as attribute because
isn't it is?
Yeah, I was like, is it as or is it is?
Well, either way, this is the part where you could subclass existing.
It is.
It is?
Yeah. It is. It is not as. It is.
Maybe this should be the episode title.
Is it as or is it is? It is.
This is where you can subclass existing HTML elements. So all custom elements have to inherit from are classes that inherit from HTML elements.
Right.
But actually, I think for the longest time, you could also subclass from HTML button element if you wanted to get all the functionality of button and just add some stuff. And then you would use this syntax. However, I think Safari never supported it and still doesn't, but I'm not sure on that now.
100% correct. WebKit said no. They fundamentally do not like this as a system. And I kind of agree. Like, when you have a custom element and it's like my dash select or whatever, going from that to form with an as attribute of as my form or whatever is
maybe the as syntax is not great, but shouldn't if I write a custom element called my input field, why shouldn't it be able to get all the existing work of an input field and I just want to add stuff?
I think it was seen as being too hard to integrate with the parser.
Oh.
And who owns the shadow DOM in that case? So which is why for input fields, you would just create a custom element, but you use the element internals API to say, by the way, I'm actually a form field. I think there's a static property as well to say that you're form associated.
I see.
Yeah, we don't have the equivalent for the form element itself. Because if you put a form in a shadow root, it will handle inputs that are inside it that are also in the shadow DOM, but not inputs that are slotted, that are kind of part of another shadow DOM or the light DOM.
Right. I do sometimes feel that shadow DOM introduced complexity and unintuitive behavior that to this day I'm actually not always on board with.
I do agree, actually. And I do wonder if this stuff was kind of 3-engine collaboration. I wonder how much better we could have got.
I mean, because I understand because you do want to somehow find a way to explain how does the video tag show controls that are clearly like buttons and divs and sliders, but they do not appear in the DOM. Like your normal DOM, it's just a video tag element. So I kind of can see how that gave birth to Shadow DOM as an explanation of what that is. But yeah, there's so much weirdness going on in these kind of things where you want your element to be a form, so you put your form in the Shadow DOM and then you slot things in, and even the slots are already a bit confusing, I have to admit. But then it doesn't behave as you expect. Like, it's a lot.
Yeah, so let's say you're creating a custom select element, but you want the options to be able to contain like DOM tree stuff, like a video, an icon, or like even just emphasis and strong tags, right? And so when the select is collapsed, you want to just render the selected option there. But when it's opened, you want to show all of the options, in their order and in their groups, if you have groups or whatever. Like, you can't do that with web components.
Yeah.
Because, you've got the equivalent of the option element there, and you've got slots, but you can't slot elements that aren't direct children of the element. And whereas like in this case, you might be wanting to take that option, which is inside a group with other options, and you're wanting to put that kind of as the selected item. You just cannot do that because it's not a direct child.
It kind of seems to me just as like, this really should, like the way you map your light DOM children into your shadow DOM should not be declarative. There should be a programmatic escape hatch.
There is a programmatic way, but you can only pick elements that are direct children of the host.
But why?
Yeah, well, okay. I have been exploring this, and it isn't straightforward because, there can be cases where...
Don't tell me it's about iframes.
It's not about iframes, it's about events, and you could end up with, if you're picking something that's quite deep in the tree to be, somewhere else, like the event has to travel through the light DOM and then through the shadow DOM, but then it's going to appear out kind of deeper within the light DOM, and then it
basically either skipped elements in the light DOM in the bubbling process, or
repeat.
Kind of has to reset further down. Yeah, I see that.
Repeating is more the risk. But I think all of this is solvable. I really do. And I've filed an issue because I think this would be like really useful, but I recognize that it is not like, what you doing? Come on, just ship it. Like it's not an easy problem. I can see why they didn't do it, but I still think we can fix it. The other sort of issue with web components is the server rendering story, right? Like,
yes,
before your JavaScript loads, your custom element is going to render as nothing or broken. Like
I think the first solution was the unresolved pseudo selector in CSS, which would allow you to apply styles to tags whose custom elements definition had not been loaded.
Yeah, and I think that's okay for things like form fields, buttons, things like that. You can probably use a small bit of CSS to reserve the room needed for that component.
Yeah.
So you don't get a layout shift when the real thing loads in. And I think it's good in a way because it means you'd just be reserving space for the element until it is interactive. And I think that's one of the big problems we see with frameworks today. Like, I think it encourages you to server render an interactive thing, which is not going to work. You're going to have buttons that don't work until the rest of the JavaScript is loaded. Anyway, whatever. But you're really stuck with things like, trying to divide it between, you've got these interactive components, but then you also have these HTML macros.
Yeah.
Like, a grid component, it's just an HTML macro, really, because it's just going to, as in a React grid component, it's just going to spit out a div with some other divs and a bit of CSS. It doesn't do anything beyond that.
And you know what? That is a very common pattern on native platforms. Like both iOS and Android all have kind of like an XML or an XML-like syntax to define the layout hierarchy of your view of whatever is on screen. And they usually have like, now actually flex and grid are quite popular there. Like what was standard in CSS now kind of propagated to native platforms. I talked about in Bevy that it's there, but you have these components that just lay out their children according to these algorithms, and they're just elements. And in native land, that's fine. And on the web, it feels weird. Maybe it shouldn't. I don't know.
Yeah. React Native has Flexbox as a component. Yeah, and which is trying to be as CSS-y as possible, or match the CSS definitions of these things. But yeah, it doesn't work as a custom element because, unless you can ensure that your custom element's JavaScript has loaded before this tag appears, which normally means loading it as blocking JavaScript.
Well, I mean, this feels like something. It doesn't work as a component with unresolved styles because the styling depends on the attribute values, and you can parse
exactly that.
Yes, that's an issue.
And of course, you can have CSS that targets the different attributes, but
true,
like at some point, it doesn't scale.
And now that I think about it, to an extent, if you want, like for say flex direction, totally doable. If this container has an attribute flex direction with value column, you set flex direction to column. What would make this better? You're right, still probably not scalable to the end, but it's better if the stupid attribute function in CSS would work.
The ATTR, yes. And you're just sort of piping an attribute through to CSS. Yeah, that would be pretty good. If they are one-to-one, absolutely.
I mean, you would have to do like string concatenation, because if you did like, I don't know, I guess you would still use like if I was thinking that if you had like a grid component and you would say grid template rows equals repeat blah something. It's just, again, it's the entire string just taking copy paste into CSS. So it would work. It would be quite powerful. I have often found myself wishing that Attr as a CSS function would be supported for more than just, I think on pseudo elements before and after, I think you can use them.
Yes, you can for the content.
Yes, for content, exactly.
And it'd be nice because maybe it could be used to explain how the SVG presentational attributes work. Maybe. But the other solution we have for this is declarative shadow DOM.
This is literally, this is my reaction to it. And I have to admit, I haven't even looked at what that is in a long time.
It's a template element with an attribute on it, which says, make me the shadow DOM for the parent element.
And the browser will automatically create a shadow root on the element the template tag is in, put the contents of the template tag into the shadow root, even before the custom element is necessarily loaded or resolved. It's literally just like a template tag. You put it under a div, because you can't just put a shadow root under a div as well, right?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure this will work just on any element. Yeah, but it does need to go in every element. So for every grid instance of your grid web component, you would be putting in this template with the declarative shadow root, which would include the CSS that it needs. And yes, you could you could import the CSS to dedupe.
I was going to say, which is silly, but I guess that's slightly better.
Yeah, it means that you're having a separate CSS file for each component, which is...
But again, also same problem, right? You still don't get access to the attributes on the element that you're being...
So this is the thing. What you would end up doing is, because as the server rendering tool, you know what attributes you're writing.
Oh, no.
You will therefore know which declarative shadow DOM to create for that first render, which means that you now need to have a build script.
Which makes the add imports trick moot, because you now...
Well, no, you still import your CSS. That should be fine. Like that, because you are just defining the same shadow DOM that you would with script, but you're just sort of kicking it out from the server.
Oh, so you would basically just set the properties that the attributes correspond to, and then add imports the rest, and then the cascade will take care of merging the styles. I guess you could even use CSS variables, right? Like you could just, the server renders out a batch of CSS variables as inline styles, and it imports the generic styling, and then things start working together.
Oh, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, well, because you would use class names, right? And just as you do with your normal shadow root, it should be one for one, but it means that you're going to have a special build script that outputs those. And then it's kind of like, I've now lost the simplicity of custom elements, which is just put a tag on the page. I now have to have a full build system behind it. And it's again like, well, what am I really gaining compared to...
To be fair, you also need a custom render script for any UI framework you want to server render.
I guess one of the selling points of custom elements, it could be like, well, you don't need that. you don't need a complex build system. You just stick the tag out. But this solution to the server rendering problem is like, well, you are going to have, and in this case, it's not making it worse than React. It's just kind of like something which is often touted as a benefit of web components is suddenly gone. So what is the point?
Yeah, I guess like the point with custom elements was like, oh, all these like this machinery of like, you automatically get attribute change callbacks. So that is machinery in the browsers. You don't have to ship code to get that.
Yes.
But for server rendering, there is no HTML parser by default in Node or something that can actually, because you need to probably execute your custom element properly to figure out what is the server declarative shadow DOM code that needs to be inline. So that requires all this machinery. And that, like you say, that's the simplicity you've now lost. It's just another library that you need to do to stringify your web app so you can server render it.
What we do at Shopify, because we are working on some web component stuff, and what we do is we have our shadow root defined using Preact. And we kind of made that decision just because like it's a syntax familiar to a lot of the developers at Shopify, because we use React sort of everywhere, but we're using Preact because it's smaller and we didn't need the complexity. Another reason for that choice was, at some point, if we need it, we now have the ability in Node to render to string that shadow root very easily, because we won't need the DOM because we have a Preact definition of it all.
Yes.
And then we can just, turn that into the contents of a template element if we need it. We haven't done that yet, but it's there. And so if we're starting to get like, so what is the point And like I say, we're using them at Shopify. And the reason is, like, because you're building something which is real DOM, it will work in every framework that works with the DOM.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. So this is the idea. If you're using Vue.js, it's like, well, we can ship you a component that works in Vue.js. So if you're using Preact, well, it's just the same thing. It works in Preact. The rough edge here is React 18 and below. They are just fixing it for 19, but a very small sort of wrapper components you can provide, which will generically make this stuff work in React as well. And I think this is where the benefit of web components is, because it's so much better than what came before for creating components that don't care what they're running in, which, like, before it was like jQuery UI or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Where you had to sort of put an element on the page somewhere and then another little bit of JavaScript, which you tell it, like, stick the date picker in here, please. And then it's all part of the light DOM, and you can end up, especially if you're using a framework around it, you can end up sort of two systems fighting over the light DOM. So yeah, I think that's one of the benefits. With Squoosh, we, just for laughs, really, we made a couple of web components in there, like for pinch zoom.
Yes.
And for the component which lets you sort of slide between the left-hand side image and the right-hand side image. We made those as web components, and it was actually pretty easy. And I have taken those components and used them in other projects. And it's like, well, this
pinch zoom, man, the amount of times I've grabbed for it, it's so good.
Right. And you didn't have to use Preact, even though, like, Squoosh is built with Preact, but that component can be used anywhere.
Funnily enough, in most projects I was already using Preact, but I just knew that this element was written well with with the right handling of touch and mouse wheel events, and using scaling on the compositor, all these things I knew it did right. And it is, I think, very small. It's still on NPM to this day, I think.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And so I think that's where all of a sudden the whole web components thing becomes worth it, is when you are targeting multiple, like, frameworks, which I don't, or no frameworks at all. I don't think many people are. And I think it was Adobe Photoshop for web. Did they use web components? Was that, or there was like, maybe like Salesforce or some other teams, like, sort of building their sites with web components?
Salesforce, maybe. Adobe also does that, but I don't think it was Photoshop Web, because I think that's, or is it? I thought it was a lot of WebAssembly in there. I don't know.
Oh, definitely WebAssembly. I think, yeah, if I was building an app, I wouldn't be choosing web components. I might use components within the app, but only if I had that, if that portability was something that was mattering to me, which I can't decide if that's a failing of web components or not. It is a failing if you're saying web components are competing with React, but I think it always comes back to that was a missell.
Missell or misunderstanding. I think by the time web components was used as a term, React had already taken claim to the word components and associated with very specific expectations that web components do not meet. And I think I would say they shouldn't. There needs to be something else, like another orchestration layer for those elements, because they're really just that. They're custom elements, individual elements, and not components that orchestrate other components generically. Because that's just not a thing in HTML in general, I feel like. The select element is probably the most orchestrated element that we have in HTML, maybe. And if that's the pinnacle of high-level component, then yeah, they can compete with a React component, which does like, here's a whole carousel with tabs and a 3D animation in the corner or something,
Yes, absolutely. And I think the thing that's holding us back there is HTML. We talked about this in the putting React in the browser episode, but I don't know, the more I think about it, the more I think, like, if we want to get anywhere close to that, we need to come up with a format. Like, it takes all of the good bits of HTML, like the streaming and that, but gives us more than just strings as attribute values, and maybe sort of demystifies some of the property attributes things. I don't know, but it does feel like it's the HTML format that's holding us back for some of that. Yeah,
and that's the thing, right? Because people look at JSX and think, oh, it's the same, but it works. So why can't it work on the web? Because, well, one of the big differences in JSX, you are actually handling arbitrary values as property values, and that makes a big difference.
And no streaming, because it's processed inside out. Like, it's kind of leaf first due to its sort of nature of, well, because it's literally JavaScript. So it's like if you have a function which takes an argument which is the result of a function, and you keep going deeper like that, it has to be handled leaf first, and it's your outer thing which is called last, because it has to find out what the attributes are by calling all of the inner functions. So that's kind of backwards to how HTML works. So yeah, that requirement means you hurt streaming. So yeah, JSX isn't the answer, but it has parts of the answer in there. Like it has the benefits in there that we want. That HTML doesn't.
Agreed.
But also, I think there's some quick wins as well. I would love to see a version of declarative Shadow DOM that didn't need to be repeated for every element. Like you could just have sort of like one template tag.
I feel like, yeah, this seems there's enough precedent on the web with like a for or template. You could like reference another template tag by ID or something. It doesn't seem like a wild leap to add this kind of function. We have it with label. We even have it like SVG has it, right? Like you can instantiate the same object with a link tag multiple times by just referencing it by ID.
Exactly. I think the complicating factor here is like if you have a template tag and you say, look, I want to be the initial shadow root for all my select elements, you have a case there where you have literal elements inside that template tag that are going to be represented multiple times throughout the page. So you would have to say like, are they cloned? Or is there some kind of crazier thing going on? Like, is it something like SVGUs? I don't know. And who knows how that works? I don't know if that's...
I would have just always assumed it's a clone, that a template is just that, as a template that needs to be instantiated.
Right. And then if you go and modify that template using the DOM, like what happens? It just... everything that was created prior to that doesn't pick up those changes, which I think is reasonable. I think that's reasonable.
Yeah.
I can imagine that conversation going badly at a spec meeting.
At that point, JavaScript is in play, which means the elements have been registered and are active. So if you have something that needs to be updated, that should be part of the element code.
That is fair. Yeah, that's really it. It's not a happy tale, but I'm enjoying using web components at Shopify for, as we sort of work towards that payoff of being able to give people components and not require them to use a particular framework. But like really, if that requirement wasn't there, I wouldn't be using them because it's just pure overhead other than that. So yeah, I can see where people are coming from when they very strongly dislike web components, especially if they feel it's been sold to them as a competitor to React, and I can see why they would feel that. But for that use case of like the jQuery UI, but today, like sharing components around, it's certainly the best we've got.
Absolutely. I would agree with that.
Shall we go away?
Is that, do we do the thing where we just end the podcast?
Yeah, never speak to each other again until the next episode.
Oh yeah, just take a break for another year for no good reason. That landed well.
Oh, we could do that. That'd be nice.
I don't know. Well, we have our summer vacations, I think, covered with content now, so that's good. So we can come back with more clickbaity, inflammatory podcast title, where then the podcast itself is quite nuanced and actually not that interesting.
Oh, exactly. Well, that's how to do it today. It's all in the title. The title's the most important bit. Like the rest of this is just, whatever. No one's listening at this point.
Should we start doing like shocked face thumbnails?
Oh, God. You'll notice that they crept into the last few episodes of HTTP 203, like the shocked face,
the titles
thing, and the titles. To be honest,
you said 203, and I immediately thought OTMT because you've
set up just an alias. Well done.
Yeah, it's in my head. It's all the same. It's my brand. Well, I guess with this weird ending, there's nothing left to say. But
happy next time.
Bye.